This talk is going to be a little bit of a slight deviation from some of the earlier talks we heard about today. So a lot of the earlier talks focused on philosophy around AI or new technology. This will be a more business-oriented talk around AI. So maybe to step back a second, my name is Jonah Burian. I'm an investor at a firm called Blockchain Capital. We were the first ever blockchain fund, started over a decade ago. Early investors in companies like Tether, Circle, Coinbase, Kraken, Polymarket, Aave, Ethereum, just to name a few. And we're undergoing one of the biggest paradigm shifts of the ages. And if you look right now at the internet, do you guys know how to move the slides? Oh, okay, perfect. Okay, so if you look at the internet right now, over 50% of web traffic now originates from AIs. Over 50% of web traffic are bots. So what a lot of people are predicting is that a similar dynamic is going to take place, but on blockchains. Namely, a lot of people are predicting that the next billion blockchain users will actually be agents. But if that is true, very, very few people have asked the second order question, namely, who stands to benefit economically from this transition? What are the businesses of the future that will benefit from the next billion users being AIs? Who has the best business models? Okay. So anyways, the way this talk's going to go is we're going to do a brief history lesson. We're going to go through how people have thought about similar questions about value capture and business models in blockchain, look at the past, and then from there, we're going to hopefully build a framework to then apply to the current day and age. So we're going to do a little bit of a history lesson. So we're going to start with the internet as it looked when Bitcoin was first created, go to the early theses around blockchain, go to the modern theses around blockchain, and then talk about 5 potential outcomes that will happen post-AI. So when Bitcoin first came around, if you were to turn and you looked at Web 2, what you would see is that protocols, for the most part, turned out to be commodities. So, while the applications built on top of the protocols ended up generating a lot of revenue, commanded high margins. So if you looked at things like TCP, IP, HTTP, they were widely adopted. It was actually incredible. Everyone was using them. But these things were not businesses. They were public goods for the most part. They were open source. They generated almost no revenue. But the things on top of them, the things built on top of them, so think Google, think Facebook at the time, these things were generating a lot of revenue. So that was kind of the market structure of the early internet, and the internet enlarged today. And then came along blockchains. And the dominant value capture thesis was that actually blockchains would flip this dynamic. Suddenly, you would have a situation where protocols would generate the lion's share of the revenue, while the applications that sat on top of the protocols would generate very little. At least that was the theory. And to steelman why people thought that, it made a lot of sense. First of all, uniquely, blockchain protocols had an economic model. They were able to generate fees. They were able to charge for block space, charge for swaps, whatever. HTTP was unable to do that. There was no business model around HTTP. On top of that, blockchain protocols did a ton of the heavy lifting. Blockchain protocols, for the most part, did almost everything out of the box. So let's use Uniswap as an example. Uniswap built this phenomenal swap protocol. So if you were an application built on top of Uniswap, you were a very thin layer. You were just pointing at a protocol that did almost everything. So the thesis was, well, any application that tried to charge a fee, users would just go to the other application that wasn't charging a fee. In effect, applications would be forced into a pricing war, at least this was a theory, which would squeeze application margins, and all the margins would go to the protocols. As a result, as you guys all remember, you saw tons of capital, tons of VC money flow into protocols, thinking that, oh my God, imagine if I can earn the slice of the dominant protocol of the ages. It would be, imagine if I could have invested in HTTP if HTTP had a business model. So the thesis made sense in principle, but what turned out to happen, and this is the state of the world today, is that applications ended up being the dominant revenue, the people with the dominant revenue. And the protocols ended up getting squeezed. And you see this in the numbers. If you go look at a dominant application like a Tether or like a Phantom Wallet or like a Polymarket or a Pump.Fund or any of these large at-scale applications, they generate tremendous amount of revenue. But if you were to look at the protocols, not so much. Look at Ethereum, for example. The fees are down and to the right. A lot of this is a function of block space becoming abundant and no longer scarce. But there's some other dynamics at play as well. And before we switch gears to think about human dynamics to agent dynamics, I want to provide some intuition about why the fat app thesis ended up kind of being what we see today. So the best intuition behind the fat app thesis is this. Turns out the most valuable thing, or the most valuable relationship in crypto and blockchain was owning the end user, was the user relationship. Getting a user is really hard. But once you got the user, you were able to monetize. So I'm going to use wallets as the example here. So if you're a wallet and you get a user, you suddenly are able to offer them tons of products to monetize that relationship. You can offer them swaps and put a small fee on top. You can offer yield and charge a couple bips. You could offer them a credit card and charge them interchange. So there's amazing business models once you own that relationship. And users turn out to be relatively fee insensitive, have a lot of brand loyalty, and for the benefit of having this beautiful UI or whatever, people don't switch too often. Switching to a new financial application is just annoying. And people, as a result, tolerate a certain level of fees. On the other hand, now the application needs to serve the user request. The application wants to give you a swap. So the wallet says, well, I'm just going to route the user to the person offering the cheapest price at this moment in time. So if the user wants to buy ETH, which protocol is offering the cheapest price? So in effect, that dynamic allows the application to force commoditization pressure onto the protocols. Why? They always choose the cheapest protocol, right? So what ends up happening is protocols are forced into this pricing war because they're disintermediated from the end user, and their margins start compressing. And the same is true at the blockchain level, right? There's abundant block space, so blockchains fight for having lower and lower and lower fees, compressing their margins as well. As a result, you see value flow up the stack and go to the applications, precisely the inverse of what the FAT protocol thesis predicted, and very similar to the early internet. So that's kind of the intuition behind the FAT app thesis. And now I want to shift gears to going back to that original question. This all works for humans, but we're predicting, perhaps, that the next billion users will be agents. And there's an interesting problem. Agents kind of break this mental model. Why? Well, a lot of the reason apps worked was because they relied on user loyalty, on people's loyalty to brand affiliations, people's high switching costs. Agents, in theory, are rational, right? They did not suffer switching costs. It's very easy for an agent to switch which service provider they're using. So does that kind of mechanism of owning a user relationship when a user is an agent still hold, or does it completely upset the balance and will change the market structure? So that's the kind of the big question to be asking for this influx of agents on chain. So we're going to now go through 5 potential outcomes as a result of this transition, and we'll talk about some of the logic about why that could actually end up being the outcome. So let's start with option 1. Option 1 is actually the world doesn't change, or the value capture dynamics don't change. And instead what happens is applications kind of reinvent themselves for agents. They basically go headless. They shed the UI, and they have basically an API to the application. And as a result, suddenly, agents might use this headless application, the way a user would use an application with a front end, and applications will still dominate. And it kind of makes sense. So going back to the wallet example, wallets aggregated the swap protocols, they aggregated the yield sources, they added credit cards, they made a bunch of custody features, they do the indexing. So it's all under one API, so maybe an agent will prefer that. And suddenly the agent API relationship will be quite similar to the agent the human application relationship. And then in turn, nothing changes. Apps still own the end user. That's option 1. Option 2 is that maybe protocols reemerge. And the steelman to that would be, well, agents are rational. They say, all this wrapper application, this headless application's doing is they're aggregating. They're aggregating a bunch of protocols I can go directly to, right? So I could just go around, the application, go direct to the protocol, and just, use the protocol. And under that reality, suddenly the protocols own the end user and are no longer disintermediated from the end user like before, and perhaps that'll allow protocols to command more of a margin. The application guys don't think that, obviously. I mean, if you look today at the big applications, so Robinhood, for example, went headless. Base just launched their headless version of their app. Even in Web 2, Salesforce launched a headless app. So the applications are betting on this not happening, but you could see an argument why maybe they get routed around. So now let's go to case 3. Case 3 is, wait a second, maybe we didn't take case 2 far enough. Maybe agents are smart enough to say, I'm going to route around applications to protocols, but for whatever action I'm doing, I'm going to choose the cheapest protocol at that moment in time. Functionally acting like the applications of today of always choosing the cheapest option or the best bang for your buck. So under that reality, agents end up asserting commoditization pressure onto the protocols. The applications are routed around, so pricing power collapses across the stack, which means you have this giant economic surplus, which should accrue effectively to the agent or the person running the agent. So that's option 3. Option 4. Maybe this entire framework is wrong. Maybe agents grow the pie so much. And why does that matter? Well, if we're talking about, okay, does someone lose 30% market share? But if the market's growing 1,000 times, the right question is not to ask, what is your market share? It's to ask, how big is that market going to get, right? 30% less of a way bigger pie is, the relevant thing is the bigger pie. So, and the reason this is not a crazy argument is that, agents in theory allow for a whole new class of economic activity. You could have, naively like sub-second portfolio rebalancing, but you might have an entire economy of agents paying each other. It's a whole class of payments that never existed before. So perhaps the economic pie grows, and the right question to be asking is not who on the margins makes more or less, but how big is this pie going to get? So now let's go to case 5. Case 5 is that maybe its entire analysis is doomed from the outset. And the reason is we might not know the business model of the future. And to motivate what I mean by that, if you were to go back to the early web, and you were to go back to when things were first getting started, if I were to tell you the dominant business model would be monetizing attention, no one even know what that meant. That was a completely foreign concept. The idea that Google knows your intent and can serve you an ad, the idea that Meta knows your, what you like and can serve you an ad, and that will be how people monetize, was foreign. So when we're talking about a huge paradigm shift, where you have agents transacting on blockchains, there might be a new business model that we've never even thought of before. And as a result, talking about the business models of the past, about transaction fees and all this, might just be the wrong framework, so it's really hard to guess who's going to capture value on an unknown business model. You can speculate, but it's a tough question. So I think those are realistically the 5 cases. Again, applications continue to win, protocols continue to win, no one wins, everyone wins, or doomed question. So those are the 5 cases. I'm going to end with the fact that, at least in the short to medium term, I don't think that the only users will be agents, and we'll probably have humans and agents coexist. The same way in the web today, more than 50% of web traffic comes from bots, but humans still use the web. And what will probably end up happening is that the fat app thesis, as it relates to the human relationship, will continue. You'll still be able to monetize the user relationship when it comes to humans via the application layer. And alongside it, some sort of new economic arrangement will develop around agents. So I guess to close it out, I can speculate on the future, but I don't have the answers. We don't have the answers. I do think, though, it's a worthwhile question to think about, because a lot of the folks in this room, in theory, are building around agents and building towards this future. So I'm going to leave it with, if you're building towards this future and have a view on who captures value, why they capture value, what is the business models of the future, I would love to chat after, or you can reach out to me on X. I have my X up there. So anyways, thank you all for having me. It was really a pleasure to chat. Awesome. Does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, you referred to the case where the pie grows, which I guess is to be expected, but it's not just the pie, it's the characterization of the pie changes, right? Like, as you said, there could be like different economic activity, for example, like AI commerce,
Yeah.
right? And this is fundamentally different than DeFi. The business model of AI commerce is fundamentally different than AI DeFi product.
Yes.
So in that regard, the competing thesis do not really say it, right?
So that's an interesting question. I'm going to push back a little bit, which is that the application thesis was also true for stablecoins. So when you think about agentic commerce, we're talking about, in theory, at least the blockchain version, is agents transacting with stablecoins. And what we've seen just over the years has been that applications have similarly had the dominant business model as it relates to stablecoins. I want to unpack that. So if you look at stablecoins, there's two ways to monetize stablecoins. For the most part, I mean, there's actually four, but I'm going to go through the two dominant ones. The first is you charge yield. You earn the float on the stablecoins, right? So you keep the user's balances in treasuries, you earn a float. The second way is to charge transaction fees. Turns out, no one wants to, if I'm sending you $100, I don't want the person to receive $97. It's really indefensible to charge a transaction fee. So you're seeing transaction fees get squeezed. So if you look at who generates value from stablecoins today, it's one of the largest revenue items is actually the float. So a lot of people assume that the issuers, the people that issue the stablecoins, are the ones that earn most of the money here. But increasingly, we're seeing applications earn the money. And the way this works is that if I'm an application and I have let's use a wallet as an example. Let's say there's $1 billion of stablecoins in my wallet for my users. What I could basically do is I can go to the stablecoin provider and say, look, you either give me a share of the yield, or I'm going to put a button on my UI to have people move to a new stablecoin and give the user an incentive, and I'll take the yield for myself. And you're seeing this happen. So for example, early days Coinbase went to Circle and gave a similar proposition, and what ended up happening, all of the yield, for the most part, of USDC on Circle, Coinbase earns, not Circle. In fact, 50% of the yield, not on Coinbase, but just out in the wilds for Circle, for the most part, Coinbase earns. So Coinbase is able to leverage its position as an application to command a share of the yield. And you see this dynamic play out across a lot of different apps in crypto. And for example, Hyperliquid, if you saw the whole dynamic that went on with the negotiations around the stablecoin, applications have increasingly been able to generate the margins on stablecoins despite the issuer business model. Tether's an exception, and I'm happy to go through why the dynamics around Tether is a little bit different. But all I'm trying to say is that for the most part, the whole stack and the whole thesis still very much holds for stablecoins, right? Like applications are dominant today when it comes to monetizing stablecoins. Perhaps in the future, right, an agent might do that negotiation themselves or route to a stablecoin that actually has yield or whatever. But I actually think the stablecoin business models and market structure is remarkably similar to DeFi. It was a long-winded answer of saying that. And any other questions?
Missing out on the people behind the agents, and like the agents are not going to just be doing stuff without anybody behind them, right? And like, I mean, a part of these people are going to be like just normal end users who say, okay, I want my agent to use that app. In which case,
okay, so this is a really interesting question. So
it's like on the flip side, you have like probably like other people who are at the moment using algo trading, and then.
Yeah, it's actually a really interesting question. So this is an open question we've been thinking about, which is that if I tell my agent I want to go buy Ethereum, will the users of the future say, hey, agent, please use Phantom's headless app to buy Ethereum, or will you just say buy Ethereum? If it's the latter, then there's an open question what choice the agent makes. Do they rather something that's everything in one, namely going through a headless app, or do they rather go straight to a protocol and cut it out? So there's an open question. Or maybe users are still so loyal to these end applications that you ask them to use Phantom. So it's an open question, and depending on the user's interaction with their own agent, it definitely affects the market structure. Separately, there's the question of if agents are acting on their own accord, right? You have this notion of sovereign agents, which a lot of people speculate about. Maybe the market structure is somewhat different than if a human's running it. So the truth is, it's a fantastic question. It's an open question.
Yeah, thank you. I really like the options you presented. I would be interested to maybe squeeze out a bit more commitment to where it is, because I felt your main story was pretty much, well, you can have the biggest margin and you can have the best business model where you are in contact with users. Pretty much relationships is where the money lies, right? And it seems in this new scenario, well, you have users, agents, right? So it seems, I mean, so I was wondering, because you didn't want to commit, it seemed, to any of the future scenarios, why don't you go along and say, well, this seems like agent seems to be the next big business model, and of course, if the people that build applications, agents maybe cooperate, right, or build a block together, you could say, well, there might also be maybe good business models for application depending on who owns what. But it seems like first foremost, agents is the new business model and the link between users and agents, right? Why don't you commit to that deal?
Yeah, so I guess, I mean, part of the answer is that there's an entire business model in relationship to, right, for the agent, who makes money? Is it Anthropic? Is it the clouds, right? There's a whole question about at least who makes money on you using the agent. That is a kind of part of the AI stack that I don't go into. So there's going to be a whole business models around that. I mean, I was just out of scope for the talk, right? There's a question of, are the models commodities, in which case, right, then the models margins go to zero. This might be a function if there's open source AI, then, right, you might, then you're not going to be able to charge more than the open source model, which is functionally free. There's a bunch of questions around that. So then maybe the clouds make the money, or maybe the models get so good that they're not commodities. So the whole AI stack is an interesting talk unto itself. I chose not to focus on it, but there's a bunch of business models there, don't get me wrong. The reason I didn't commit to it is that a lot of the question comes down to how rational are agents, and how hard is it for agents to kind of rebuild a lot of the infrastructure that these companies have built, so for routing to DEXs and all that, and it's just an unclear answer. I mean, for at least for me, I'm always so surprised about how smart agents are sometimes, but then like also how dumb they are. Like they can't notice the most simple thing, like you ask them to count how many A's are in a word, they don't know, but then like they can like one-shot an app. So it's hard to kind of begin predicting the rationality of an agent and how they think. So it's just something hard to commit to, which is why I guess I'm trying, just the humility of saying I don't know the answer, but I can theorize about answers. Any other questions? Okay, well, anyways, thank you all for having me. This is really a pleasure.